or lived in a city and I went down to a liquor store. I go open the door. It's like reinforced, metal and bulletproof glass. There's a metal detector that's there. There's a security guard that's armed who wands me down. I walk into the actual store. It's floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. I've got TVs everywhere showing me in the store and what's going on out the store. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, okay, this is the safest place I have ever been in my entire life. And yet I've never been more scared in
I
my
was going to
entire
say, it
life.
doesn't feel safe, even though
Right?
you are. Yeah.
Because the narrative changes. The narrative doesn't become, oh, look at all these protection measures. Aren't I safe? It's look at all these protection measures. What the hell goes on here
To
that
make
they
you need
felt the
that.
need to make this all, to put all this in?
It's funny because when I came across what you do, I thought how timely it is with TVTP, right? And the approach to preparedness rather than being proactive rather than being reactive. And I really wanted to dive in to this because I think this is a strange, in terms of a new phenomenon, the danger in schools. I don't remember that in the like we had a PO officer, right? I grew up in a horse farm outside of Nashville, so it was pretty rural. There was, obviously we had lockdowns and so on. It's never 100% safe, but I just don't remember having this same level of maybe underlying anxiety that is kind of permeating within schools all across the nation.
Yeah, well, not just schools, right? I mean, so, we're seeing it at, houses of worship. We're seeing it at streets where lots of bars and restaurants are at. We're seeing it at, soccer games or, conventions and things like that. And so it is something that is beginning to become more and more prevalent. And because of that, I think there's probably room for what I do, which is sort of changing the context a little bit away from sort of the protection, preparedness / response methodologies that are sort of have been here with us for generations, and more concentration on the prevention side of looking more upstream and trying to develop different processes that are less defensive and more sort of on the offense, more proactive, as you mentioned. It's not to say that those protection measures, and when I say protection measures, I'm talking about more like the cameras and the security guards and the bulletproof glass and the fences and all those different types of things don't have a place. They do. There is value in all of those. I think one of the things that has happened with society due to just some humanistic fallacies that we all sort of tend to fall into accidentally, we have put an overvalue on a lot of those things, and therefore we have actually compounded the problem. We've created almost like a latent error where we're doing things altruistically and with the best knowledge that we have and putting logical measures in, but we are trying to change behavior of human beings, which often does not follow logic and is not reasonable. And so we need a contextual change in how we look at security as a whole. And we need to begin to start sort of redesigning or slightly reshaping these different types of systems that we have within our societal context, whether it be those in law enforcement, those in the mental health space, education, the general public as a whole, on looking at what we can do to be more in a prevention-centric sort of methodology or philosophy going forward.
So what would, like in terms of prevention, what would be like an example of what you mean by that?
So from a prevention standpoint, what you are trying to look at is sort of first off, the one thing that sort of really got me into this whole thing was this sort of paradoxical narrative or counter narrative of one against the other after a bunch of attacks had happened. So every time there's an attack that happens, you start hearing this idea of like it's a horrible, tragic, random act of violence, and it's a tragic event. But when you use the word random, what that does is that shifts your mindset into this context that there was no way we could have predicted this, right? We had no idea that this was going to happen. We had no idea that this person was getting this angry and was heading down this pathway, and therefore, we're terribly sorry, but we'll put more fences, or we'll put more officers around a building, or we'll do more training, active shooter training drills and things like that.
Seems very reactionary
in that way, right?
Yeah.
But then, like 5 or 7 minutes later, after you hear that sort of random act of violence, you start hearing about the character arc of the individual that committed the shooting, and you start finding out like, oh, they had people raise concerns at school. People raised concerns at work. There were touch points with mental health. There were touch points with sometimes law enforcement. There were a bunch of people that were sort of sounding the alarm or raising concern about that individual's behavior. Well, that's not random then, right? Like in a post 9/11 world where see something, say something is kind of like just integrated into our normal daily activities, you don't get on that many people's radar if you have a reporting problem, right? And it doesn't become a random act of violence if you know that this individual was struggling and people were sort of, things were bubbling up under the surface here. And so that sort of weird counter narrative dichotomy there really got me interested in sort of exploring like what is it? Like obviously there is something going on that these people keep falling through the cracks, right? And yes, when you look at the totality of targeted violence events and things like that, as opposed to sort of like the general everyday occurrences, it's a very low probability that it's going to happen, but it has an extremely high consequence, post attack. And so what I started to realize was we don't actually have a reporting problem. What we have is a coordination problem, that these systems that we have within, these different sectors are not necessarily designed for coordination and collaboration. They're designed, they are hyper specific in what they are addressing. And so, for example, law enforcement, they have protect and serve on the side of their car, not prevent and serve. Right? They are designed to be sort of reactionary or defensive in nature. And so they also operate on a threshold methodology where if you don't do anything illegal, if you don't cross over that threshold, there's not a lot of things that they are able to actually do, right? And so you may see a neighbor or a coworker or a fellow student or something like that having doing concerning behaviors or being scary or something like that, causing some alarm, and you call the police, and they're going to go and they're going to assess the situation, and if nothing illegal is happening, they'll put that individual maybe on a list, or they may talk to that individual and say, hey, cut it out, but there's really no sort of recourse that's going to happen. You go to mental health and public health entities and you say the same thing, like, hey, there's somebody concerning, they're going to ask you, okay, are they a threat to themselves or somebody else? And if you say, I don't think so, or not yet, then they're going to tell you, all right, well, then you got to get to the back of the line, because I have a stack of people on my desk that actually are, and I've only got a limited amount of clinicians, right? And so you move over to the education sector, and the education sector is very, very much sort of checklist oriented, right? They have their policies and their procedures that's dictated by law, and they have to follow those based upon different behaviors and things like that, and different sort of punishments and things like that for different types of things. They are very reluctant on sort of looking outside of that sector. because once they have to get resources outside of the sector, that puts them in sort of this legal, a lot of legal stuff have to happen. They have to incorporate the parents, and it just becomes really messy. So they like to kind of keep things all in-house. And so what ends up happening is that that individual that is sort of struggling and is beginning to sort of have their grievances turn into an ideation, they are interacting with all these different sectors, but all these different sectors are getting like a 1/16th of the actual story, right? And so they're not necessarily getting the whole picture of what is happening to that individual. And because they're only dealing with like a sliver of the information or a certain context in which they are seeing that individual may not rise to that threshold, right? It may not cross it. And so they sort of sit on their hands until something sort of spills over, and then they react. And by doing that, you are really trying to thread a really thin needle of time, because typically what it is that somebody, that individual will announce that they are going to do an attack, or they are headed that way, or they have entered the building with a weapon or something like that, or shooting has already started, and therefore they have crossed this theoretical threshold, and now we're into response, right? And the frustrating part is always sort of post attack. You begin to sort of pull on these threads and sort of see this individual who was kind of spiraling out of control, that people knew about it, that people were reporting about it, but they were just sort of in their own contextual sort of systematic sort of framework, and it just didn't rise to that level. And so going forward, I think what we need to do is we need to sort of take a 30,000-foot view of things, and really sort of, instead of leaning on sort of a system of care that we have, we need to sort of incorporate sort of more of a concept of care, right? Where even the most minor of instances elicits some type of proactive reaction, right? Because people are not singular in their sort of their crises, right? They sort of build upon one another. And one of the things that I often say is that there is no such thing as a random act of violence, whether it's, yelling at a barista for spelling your name wrong, or it's a road rage incident, or it's a targeted violent attack or a terrorist attack, right? There is a long lead up of sort of a death by 1,000 paper cuts that then all of a sudden explodes onto the scene in sort of an aggressive or violent behavior. And so getting to those thousands of paper cups, those seemingly innocuous one-off events, and wrapping services around them, or having a philosophy of coordination to try and figure out, okay, they're upset at this moment about this one thing, but what contributed to their grievance of that one thing are these 6 other things that also need to be solved. And that requires a lot more different resources from a lot more different people to sort of help that out and iron that out. And so that way, these individuals don't get down this scientifically proven pathway of violence and going through all these different stages. We can get them way before they even begin to start thinking that violence is sort of like a means to an end.
So when you say get them before, right, like, there's a couple things that I'm hearing here, and I want to kind of make the distinction right off the bat here. Number one, my mind goes to Minority Report, predictive analytics. And number two, this is kind of what Palantir to a large degree is being sold as a collective of data, right? Whereas these agencies or organizations don't have all the puzzle pieces. This is like an aggregate place where all of those puzzle pieces can go together. What is First of all, like, how do you prevent this from being a pre-crime situation?
Right. And it's kind of a bastardization of what prevention is in what you've sort of outlaid. And I'll tell you sort of why. So one sort of the minority report kind of thing, um, the idea that you are going to be able to scan someone's eyeballs or take a look at certain media posts and then decipher through that a probability or a risk probability of somebody doing something is logical in the sense of sort of like that sort of A plus B equals C type of mentality, right? The problem with that is that humans don't operate in an A plus B equals C thing. Okay, our behaviors. Most people think our behaviors are from our thoughts and opinions about something. That we think about something or we have an opinion about something, and that translates into our behaviors and how we feel about something. It's actually the direct opposite. We feel something first, that translates into a behavior, and then our thoughts and opinions are almost post-rationalized off of our behavior. And so there was a study that was done a couple of years ago on first time car buyers of electric vehicles. And they asked them to rank why they bought an electric vehicle. And sort of like the first three are typically subjective feelings. Looks cool, love the tech, cool performance, things like that, right? Environmental impact was down at around 7 or 8, okay? They bring these exact same people in about a year later, and they ask them the exact same question, and all of a sudden environmental impact is up at 1 or 2, okay? The actual physical behavior of driving it, not the reason why we bought the car. The reason why we bought the car is because we felt certain things, okay? Then the behavior of driving the car changed the order, right, of our thoughts and opinions. And so when we were asked a year later, when those people were asked a year later why they bought the car, they post-rationalized the reason why they bought that car, okay? Because
This
they
is
didn't say...
this is a relatively standard principle in marketing and sales in general. It's people buy on emotion and justify through logic later.
Exactly.
Right. Which is why
100%.
most of the copyright pages, the landing pages are going to be emotional first and then more logical, as in people process, they buy on emotion, and then they're justifying as they go to the checkout page, right?
100%. So that scanning of your eyeball, minority report sort of thing of like it dismisses the feelings around that behavior, right? To the Palantir thing, there is right now AI, or at least for me, I have found limited contextual intelligence within the AI LLMs and things like that. Now, they may have something behind the curtain that operates that I don't know about.
What do you mean by limited? So do you mean like practical application or case history that it's actually been used, or what do you mean by that?
So the putting data points or putting behaviors into an LLM and then asking it to spit out sort of like a solution, right? That that takes in part all of the different contexts, right? The LLM is simply getting data put into it and then spitting out a probability, right? It doesn't understand that this individual might be... I've worked with school districts who have had individuals who are absolute terrors at school. You go to the after school program with the Department of Rec, and they say they're like the best person. They're a mentor to all the young kids, right? It's the context within that school, whatever the context is, that is causing that person to sort of, have behavioral problems. In a different context, like at the Department of Rec, they don't have that exact same issues, right? So I don't know, depending on how many data points you are collecting, right, and how deep that contextual thing goes, the probabilities that you are going to get spit out are rather nebulous. Okay.
I think, just to be honest, I think that's where the innate, and I say innate deliberately, is when, like the point of Minority Report was not we should improve the predictive analytics and then apply this. Right? Like the moral of that story was, generally speaking, people have free will and the future isn't predetermined. Like generally, right? Like that was like the general takeaway of it. And I think exactly what you're describing is the innate fear that people have. Is because to an authoritative figure or government or the military, you know, to a hammer everything is a nail. They only have, of course, there's multiple courses of actions, but they only have one recourse generally, like in a very general, right? So the solution is the same every time, right? Come down on it, right? And I think that's where the innate fear necessarily comes from. Not necessarily that we don't have all the data. It's that this data has to be placed somewhere, right? And then from there, the decisions have to be made. And from there, if you're a hammer, the decision to be made is everything's a nail.
Correct.
Right. So where is the distinction in your mind from how to actually take this data and the different context from in school or after school programs? Do you know what I mean by that question?
Let me try, and then you tell me if I'm on the right track. So we've been talking a lot about context, right? And so if I mention that a certain event is going to happen and 8% of the world's population is going to die, that elicits a feeling and a behavior of this is going to be a massive thing that's going to happen, and we need to pay attention to it. If I tell you that after this event, 92% of the world's population will survive, it becomes water off a duck's back, right? It's not that big a deal because of the context in which you are placing onto the public, right? They're saying the exact same thing.
Generally terrible. It sounds better, but still terrible both sides. I think that's your point, right?
Right. Okay. Saying the same thing, but different reactions, right? Off of what you lead with. So if you get sort of you put in a bunch of data points and you get a probability of X%. Let's go with that 8% that they are going to, based on the data that you have put in, there is an 8% chance that this individual is going to do a targeted attack. Okay, what do you do with that information? Right? Like, what level do I then react off of that? Okay, and the idea being that it is creating sort of a technological solution to a psychological problem or an emotional problem. And somebody, as you sort of have alluded to, somebody has to interpret that data to then initiate some type of response, whether it's no response or it's a full-fledged response or a half response. Somebody has to moderate that. One of the reasons why I'm sort of skeptical about sort of like the surveillance state is that it lends itself to that more protection mentality, that random act of violence.
Okay? Or the big brother, right?
Right.
Catching it before it happens. Yeah.
Because the idea that you don't know where these things are coming from, you don't know who these people are, and therefore it is imperative for us to scan everybody, to collect as much data as we can, to then get that type of context. What's interesting about this more humanistic prevention philosophy that I have is that I'm taking more of sort of the evolutionary anthropological level of looking at human beings and what they are already hardwired to do. Our brains are taking in all kinds of information, but we only have a limited amount of bandwidth. So our senses, whether it's our eyes, our sense of smell, our hearing, even that sixth sense where somebody comes in a room and it just feels different, all of those things are designed for our own security, right? Those abnormalities are things that are alerting our brain that, hey, there is something different here that you need to pay attention to. Those are sort of more telling that there is something happening than having sort of a bunch of data that has to be filtered and giving you sort of those probabilities, right, of what may occur. And it also provides the response and preparedness with an overinflated idea of where threats are coming from or what is going to happen. The idea that you put in all of these protection measures, and I've said I feel that there is not that protection and response measures are that there isn't a place for that, but that there is an overvalue on what we believe is happening. So if you put out $250,000 worth of protection measures on let's say a school, because it's easier to do it that way, what is your ROI metric on that? Because you're going to expect that if you are putting out $250,000 worth of security, you are getting $250,000 worth of security plus some. So what is the metric that you are using to measure that success? Because it cannot be that just because something didn't happen today, it's working. The other thing that is sort of weird about the protection thing is that it is subject to our own imaginations. So the idea that we will be able to thwart every eventuality or every nuance within an attack by putting in protection measures or being able to respond in an appropriate manner is simply an imaginary thing, right? And so so I think we have just structured ourselves into, as I sort of mentioned, this sort of latent error of compounding things, of thinking that these individuals are doing things, that we can combat this sort of psychological and emotional pathway with logic and data and everything else.
So what you're saying, what I'm hearing here, correct me if I'm wrong, is okay, if there's a single, I'm just using the context of a school just because it's pretty easy and it's timely for people to wrap their heads around. So obviously there's more application to this, but instead of just having one PO officer, preventative would be, well, let's get 3. Let's get more guns there, more metal detectors, more security protocols. And what you're saying is, great, you are protecting from hypothetical scenarios that might happen and or a lot of evil stuff that has currently taken place, but there's no real data or metric that you can actually point to say, well, we haven't had a school shooting here in 5 years. And it's like, great, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing here, where you're like, that's not a good measure. Preventing a hypothetical situation versus what I'm hearing is you're trying to bring the human element back into this, saying
Correct.
that it's not enough to just have more data points. It's not enough to just prevent with more resources. That's what I'm hearing. You want to provide frameworks downriver, or excuse me, upriver.
Upriver, yeah.
Yeah, upriver instead of downriver, which is just more security, more guards, more guns, more metal detectors. Yep. Am I hearing that? Okay.
You're absolutely hearing me correctly. And I've got a great story that actually happened to me personally around this. So I was in a city or lived in a city, and I went down to a liquor store. And as I'm approaching the liquor store, I see like the CCTV camera on the outside. I see some bars on the windows. There's a huge fluorescent light right near the door. I go open the door. It's like reinforced, metal and bulletproof glass. I end up going into sort of like this weird holding area after I open the door. There's a metal detector that's there. There's a security guard that's armed who wands me down. I walk into the actual store. It's floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. I've got TVs everywhere showing me in the store and what's going on out the store. And I have to do all of my commerce through a drawer, right? And I remember thinking in that moment, like, okay, this is the safest place I have ever been in my entire life. And yet I've never been more scared in my life.
I was going to say, it doesn't feel safe,
right?
Even though you are. Yeah.
Because the narrative changes. The narrative doesn't become, oh, look at all these protection measures. Aren't I safe? It's, look at all these protection measures. What the hell goes on here
to make
that they felt the need to make this all to put all this in. And so it completely changes the dynamic within the space. And when you're talking about trying to identify certain behaviors, or you're trying to not manipulate behaviors but move people in a certain direction with their behaviors, right? Or to be safety, or just public safety, right? The main goal is to kind of have this sort of Zen security type mentality, right? You want to try and make the water as still as possible within that environment so that you're able to figure out what's causing the ripples, right? And that goes back to sort of that sensory sort of thing, right? If I load the environment up with more cops, with more TV cameras, with more metal detectors, with more, I end up sort of shrinking my view of things to the things that are like right in front of my face. And I will sometimes miss those subtle ripples that I could nip in the butt really, really quick. And so when I go to schools and I talk to staff, I ask them, hey, you tell me what the difference is between a quiet kid in the corner that doesn't cause any real disruptions and is just a fine person, and the quiet kid in the corner that's in the depths of sort of isolation and is really struggling and just doesn't want to tell anybody, right? And you really can't. They can't make a distinction. And the idea that you are going to somehow make people feel safer and that they are going to act in a way that is, you know, in that sort of flow, that they are going to act in a certain way that they feel safe is not true. You go to a lot of college campuses nowadays and you'll see these blue towers, these blue sort of emergency call towers that are sort of scattered all through campuses. They've been there for decades, right? Most colleges now have a security app that they allow their students to sort of download, right? Where you can sort of live text a security guard if you're being chased or you notice something. You can be geolocated, so if you are being chased, they can see the blue dot. Live text, as I mentioned, to a security person. Some have even gone so far as another option, if students want to, they can upload their class schedule into the app, so that if you send out a distress signal and you're in room 316 at something hall, they know that the distress signal isn't just coming from the hall, but at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday, you're usually at room 317. So we're going to head right there, right? Far superior, like, security apparatus that is on basically everyone's phone and everything else. So it made those sort of blue towers, these static blue towers, relatively obsolete. And so a lot of colleges and universities had a program or were announced that they were going to get rid of them, because everybody basically has a smartphone now. Everybody is required, if you have a smartphone, to download that app. So why do we need these static things? And the student population at almost every single university and college went up in arms, because it was they couldn't understand why they were taking security away, right? And I think there's a weird dichotomy that we have between what makes us feel safe and what actually is safe. And the idea that this giant blue static sort of pole somehow conveys a much more sense of security and safety around it than an app that's on our phone that is in our own pocket.
I think,
And
what's crazy about this, not to cut you off, but
yeah,
in terms of like, so I lived in Japan for almost a decade. And when I bring that up, and people talk about how safe it is, inevitably almost everybody, especially in America, they'll ask me about, like, why? Is there just so much police everywhere? Is there more police? And it's like actually quite the opposite. Like, when you're driving on the road, it's very rare that you'll pass police. They're there, don't get me wrong. People get tickets, people have accidents, but it's significantly less common. What you're seeing is a cultural element here, right? The same concept with littering. Like there's very rarely public trash cans anywhere in Japan, but
Hmm.
there's no trash because culturally it's just not a thing, right? And that's the difference between the Western mindset and the kind of, I don't want to say the Eastern mindset, but just like from my experience of living in Japan specifically, of what you're describing there versus like the first instinct of people is to think like, oh, there must be police everywhere. Oh, there must be security everywhere. It must be like locked down all the time. That's preventative still.
Right.
When it's actually upstream in the culture in general, which leads me to like, what are we, how can, practically speaking, how can we start to address this? If it is a psychological thing, if it's a human thing, if we can all agree that we don't want to go down the big brother, more guards, more cops, more everything. And I'm a, you know, I like police. I want them to help me. I believe in their work very much so. Let's get them the training they need. But we definitely don't want 50 times the police officers on the street, because what's the difference between that and authoritarian regime?
Hmm.
Nothing. Right. So how can we actually address the culture and the psychological and the human element practically here upstream? Like, what does that look like?
So one of the things that we sort of preach, and I do trainings in something called behavioral threat assessment in management, otherwise known as BTAM. And there's a bunch of different sort of behavioral threat assessment strategies. So I'm not going to go too much into the weeds over which one is the most appropriate for whatever it is. But at its core, what behavioral threat assessment does is that it strips away looking at risk factors as predictive of future events. So what ends up happening with risk factors is two things. One, risk factors are an outside looking in lens. Okay? The idea that a certain population or a certain area of the country has certain risk factors or is doing certain risk factors is something that is it's looking out. So the people that are in that sort of risky area or doing those risky behaviors or maybe exposed to certain risk factors, that they don't look at that as risk factors. They look at that as life, right? So if you have an area that has a lot of gang activity or a lot of drug use, or there are individuals with a lot of incarceration and things like that, that's not a risk factor. That's just the way in which you live. And so by putting risk factors at the forefront, you are also imparting not only that bias of outside looking in, but your own biases towards something. And so what behavioral threat assessment does is it focuses more on, are these behaviors, are you seeing a pattern with the behaviors that is escalatory in nature as far as aggression, okay? And so by understanding that concept, we can begin to kind of break a little bit of that rigidity of the systems, okay, instead of focusing on certain risk factors. As an expert in behavioral threat assessment, I will tell you, it is a horrible name for the same reason why random act of violence is a terrible terminology. It puts people into a context of looking for threatening behaviors. One of the ways we change that culture is we begin to be sort of change the context of the culture. So a lot of the feedback that I get from schools or even through large corporations and things like that have me speak is that we get a litany of training, right? So I have a training on the signs of substance abuse. I have a training on the signs of child trafficking. I have a training on the signs of domestic abuse. I have you that comes in and talks about targeted violence and the signs of that. And it all kind of paralysis through analysis, right? It all kind of comes out in the wash. So one of the things that we began to do was we took away that sort of hyper specialization, because what people were saying was, I noticed something, but I didn't know what lane it was supposed to go into. And so what I did was I waited to see if more things presented themselves, and then I knew which lane of response I needed to go down. And so what we did with our sort of behavioral threat assessment teams was we just relabeled them care teams. And by relabeling them care teams, we were able to get people to be more proactive, that everything kind of went into the bucket and that you addressed it while it was in the bucket before you tried to specialize what response was appropriate. And so one of the things that we did was we brought bus drivers into those care teams, which had not been done before. And so, yes, they were brought in for the specific purpose of relaying information of concerning behavior that may lead to violence at the school. But what they ended up finding more often was, hey, there's a kid that's being picked up and dropped off at 2 different stops, and I don't really know why. And come to find out that, oh, there was a little bit of a substance abuse problem that was happening at that guy's school, and he was hanging out at his friend's house overnight, right? And so that has nothing to do necessarily with targeted violence, but that's definitely something that needs to be addressed, right? They found another individual who, was coming to the bus stop in a car with their family, and it looked as if the whole family, or the back of the car was with pillows and blankets and everything else. Sure enough, that family had been evicted out of their home. Again, has nothing to do necessarily with a targeted violence attack, but needs to be addressed. And so you're changing the context of what you are actually looking for and what you are trying to address. And with a care team, you can have it as small or as large as you want. And what you do from a leadership standpoint is you create that culture where we're not here necessarily to snitch on people or to call people out or to embarrass them or to get them in trouble, but we are there to sort of create an environment where we're all in this together. We all want to be safe, and we all want to feel as though we belong. And this is one of the things that really are the big trigger points of people who become quote unquote radicalized. And I use those quotes sort of loosely, and I'll explain why sort of towards the end here. But really the reason why people sort of become radicalized has to do with 3 different things. And it's something that is universal amongst all of us. At any given time, or actually at all times, we are searching for things that fill basically these metaphorical buckets of identity, purpose, and community. And we are either filling those, or we're finding things that is reconfirming those types of things. Because the human brain finds it completely unacceptable to not know who we are. Okay, we have to know what we are or where we belong or what our purpose is. And if we don't, we will go searching for it. And so oftentimes we attach ourselves to things that might be slightly unhealthy or slightly radicalized or something like that. And we get, from the outside, we get the impression that it's the message that is resonating with that individual, and that individual is bad because they are resonating with a bad message. When in actuality, it's not necessarily the message that is resonating with them, it's those 3 intangibles that is coming with the message. And so what ends up happening is we get locked in to that because, like I said, if we don't know where we are, that's unacceptable to the emotions in the brain. And so we have to attach ourselves to something. And so that, when I mention sort of radicalized, you can sort of see this in a lot of different things that aren't sort of in a threatening way or negative way. Alcoholics Anonymous uses this same sort of technique, right? I go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, I introduce myself, hi, I'm Rob, I'm an alcoholic, boom, there's my identity. My purpose, obviously I'm here, my purpose is to get clean. My community are all the other people in that room, and they share the same purpose and they share the same identity as me, so I feel connected to them, right? We're locked in. During COVID, you saw a lot of public health professionals get very, very offended at the pushback during COVID. And this isn't to go down that sort of rabbit hole and everything else, but they have a lot of letters behind their names, right? They identify as a public health professional. That's their identity. Their purpose to them is to keep the public safe in a healthy way. And their community is often other mental or public health people. So 1, 2, 3. They got offended, and this is one of the ways in which we begin to sort of push back on these individuals that are sort of heading down these pathways. Because in the same way that we look at sort of A plus B equals C in a logical way, and we attack things from a thought and opinion way rather than in an emotional way, we think that through debate or giving people facts or giving people data points and things like that, that by changing their minds on those things, changing their thoughts and opinions on something, it's going to change their behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, it goes feeling down to behaviors, down to thoughts. It does not go uphill, it goes downhill. And so when you attack or when you address what they are doing, you sort of focus in on the what that they are doing and try to change their opinion or thoughts on something or challenge them on what they are doing, that becomes a personal attack because they have attached their identity, their purpose, and their community to it, right? And what ends up happening is you get the opposite effect that you want. They begin to dig in their heels more and they retreat into that thing that they have attached to, right? And they push you away and they become more and more isolated and they become, quote unquote, more radicalized in that sense. So then how do we go about sort of getting them off that pathway, right? We often think that doing an intervention, and this is the first time you've heard me use that term, and I don't use that term when I'm sort of talking about this sort of targeted violence prevention methodology. We don't do an intervention. Intervention has a top-down power dynamic. It works for people with substance abuse. It sometimes works with people with depression and suicidal ideation, not as much. But what ends up happening is that you have somebody who is relinquishing control. They are out of control and they need somebody to take the power for them and move them to the correct path. That works with substance abuse, right? You're physically unable to break that cycle unless somebody kind of does an intervention for you and sort of forces you. As I mentioned, if you take that top-down power dynamic approach, they are going, with people that I'm talking about, you're going to retreat and you're going to get more hardened. So basically what you have to do is you have to look at this as more of sort of like a hostage negotiation. You're not dealing with a chemical dependency, you're dealing more with a psychological and emotional dependency. And you have to address it as such. You have to make sure that they stay in control. And what you have to do is present a new identity or a new purpose, a new community, or all three, right? That will fill the existing bucket at the same level, if we're going to use that same metaphor, or greater. We are only as faithful as our options dictate. And so we have seen attackers within their writings and their manifestos express contrition for what they are about to do. They say that they are sorry for the pain that they are going to cause. They are sorry for what their family is going to have to go through after this, etc., etc. And that does not match up with logic, right? If you know that you are going to do something wrong, if you are going to cause this harm, why are you staying on this path? Why do you not jump off? And the reason why is there's no landing area for them to jump off, right? There is no place for their mind to go and find a new identity or seek a new purpose or see a community that is with them. And when you present those things to them as an alternative, they are more likely to move themselves off of that path and connect with those things than with what they are doing. And the reason why we typically do not offer those different options is just sort of a way in which we interpret it, the message calls for help. Okay. If you see somebody struggling with substance abuse, or somebody who is claiming to do, have a suicidal ideation or depression, we have a tremendous amount of empathy for those individuals. We do not have the same empathy for people who are ranting and raving and saying they're going to punch us in the face, or it's this group of people that is the problem, or et cetera, et cetera. Those people, we go, you know what? I don't need that in my life, and I don't really need to be associated with that. So you just go over there, right? And what that does is that tells the individual that, okay, it's sort of more of a subconscious thing of that didn't work to get a reaction of help. And you see so many people that sort of have attacks also have a sense of suicidal ideation attached to it.
So this is the stereotypical lashing out for help.
Correct. And people with suicidal ideation might drop a little nugget of their desire to sort of do harm to themselves and test the waters, see if somebody's going to come and help them out. It's the same for people who are sort of heading down this pathway of violence. And the different stages within that pathway is sort of, it starts with a grievance, which we all sort of have. But when that grievance begins to mature into an ideation, where it becomes their sort of raison d'etre, that it's the only thing that they are sort of filtering information through, that it's the only thing they want to talk about, it's the only thing that they are interested in, et cetera, et cetera. And then you begin to sort of see signs of doing more research, going deeper into the rabbit hole, or doing research on a particular site, or doing like a physical site that they may want to attack, or doing research on a certain group of people, et cetera, et cetera. Then that moves into the prep. So they'll either begin to acquire weapons, or they will get more proficient in weapons that they already have. And then the final stage is sort of that last ditch effort, big giant breach of sort of broadcasting to try and get as much attention as possible. The subtle thing with the breaching is that it's been happening throughout the entire process, right? They're dropping these sort of breadcrumbs for people, but because it's of an aggressive nature and it's something that is sort of off-putting, we don't really look at it. We don't have that empathy. And so when you kind of going back to your original question of like, how does this become sort of the new way of which we're doing things, is it's a philosophy change. It's a philosophy change. It's not something that is systematic. It's not something that is going to be solved through sort of casual networking, where you have sort of one person who takes this philosophy, tries to do some cross-sector, cross-systems coordination, but then that individual retires, or that individual gets a new job, or different priorities happen, or funding gets cut, or something like that, and the whole network just falls apart. What has to happen is that it has to be integrated into just the way in which we do business, where they have gotten to this point because we have ignored so many other things, some major, some minor. Things like when I started talking about sort of like the behavioral threat assessment teams or the care teams, one of the reasons why we moved from behavioral threat assessment team to the care team was because things like the breakup of a boyfriend or a girlfriend, that's not going to a behavioral threat assessment team. The death of a grandfather, not going to a behavioral threat assessment team. Just quitting the hockey team or the soccer team, just willy-nilly, just for no reason, just not interested anymore, you just quit. That's not going to a behavioral threat assessment team. All three of those things, we can have varying degrees of what we think the importance of those things might be to a human psyche, but all of those things contribute to within context of other different things, right? And so by having a care team, those are the types of things that do get reported to a care team. And I think going back to, I'm kind of a little bit all over the place here, but going back to sort of that environment of how it changes the environment, how protection and response measures sort of change the environment. You see this with SROs, with school resource officers, or cops even at school. The narrative that a lot of SROs have of themselves is that they are sort of that one trusted adult, that they are extensions of the counselors that are there or the clinicians, and that students, can go to them with their issues and their problems and things like that. That is not the narrative that staff have or that students have of them. Things like breaking up with my boyfriend or girlfriend or my grandfather dying. Why would I go to the SRO? My narrative of the SRO is when shit hits the fan, you're the first line of defense, right? So why am I going to task you to work out my little hiccup in my life when I don't see any reason for you to do that? And most law enforcement don't look at themselves as having the responsibility to work that out with somebody, right? And so that kind of falls on the culture that you create within that school or that office or that town to begin to sort of bring all of these different, programs and agencies and things like that to try and get more holistic way of what is something that is abnormal. There's a town in Massachusetts, Rockport, Massachusetts, a small little town south of Boston, and their chief of police insisted that the town manager become like behavioral threat assessment certified. And when the town manager did, he realized this behavioral threat assessment team that is typically located in schools has to be brought up a level. Okay, schools being sort of the nucleus of this coordination is ridiculous for a few different reasons. One, they are not really designed to be that coordinating body, and so that responsibility is kind of above and beyond what they're designed to do. Two, the statistics on where threats are coming from are coming out of 98% of all the threats within a town are from 18 and under. So, to rob a line from comedian Tim Dillon, if that's the case, the kids are not our future, they're the problem, right? And so what they did was they elevated that up more so that the schools and law enforcement and mental health are components, but they are not the sole nucleus. They are not trying to bring people together. And one of the things that they ended up stumbling upon was that they reached out to FedEx and Amazon and the Postal Service, and along with the sanitation department. Because what they realized was, whether you like it or not, your garbage man knows when you have a party. They know what beer you like. They know what wine you enjoy. They know when you've just bought a new outdoor couch because you've put the boxes outside, right? They know a lot more about your life than you may know because they're coming around each week and they're seeing things. There wasn't an apparatus or a line for those sanitation workers to alert anyone to unusual activity. In the same way that they ended up finding out that there wasn't really any apparatus for FedEx drivers to alert authorities that they were seeing something that was wrong. Many of these delivery drivers have the same route, and they got feedback from them saying I've been on this route for 2.5 years. I've never stopped at this house. And then over the last 10 days, I've stopped there every single day, and I've been dropping off 3 packages each day, and every single one of them has hazardous materials written on it. That's kind of weird, right? Those are types of those, as I mentioned, those sensory abnormal ripples in the water that you want to sort of address early on. It may not materialize into anything, or it may be something that is completely different and completely solvable. I chose this pathway of going towards targeted violence and terrorism prevention because it's sort of the worst case end case of what can happen. But oftentimes these things are, oh, you just need a little bit of this, or you need a little bit of that, or you just need somebody to talk to and feel connected to the community or find a different purpose. There was a woman up in New Hampshire, up in northern New Hampshire, who owned a pottery shop, and there was an individual that was, roaming around the small town, causing a little bit of fear amongst the residents and things like that. And I'm not here to try to get your audience to be like intervening specialists or even intervention specialists or anything like that. Like, if you feel safe enough to do something like this, go ahead. But if not, call the authorities. But she approached the man and she said, hey, I teach this pottery course at night. I was just wondering if you would be able to, if you wanted to sit in. Like, we have free food and free drinks for the participants, and it might just be something that you might like. Sure enough, that little connection, that little nugget, right? That little spike in dopamine in that guy's head. He goes to the thing. He sees a community that is very connected. He sees a purpose of, artistic expression. He identifies with it. Now he works for her. Now he does the classes, right? This is somebody who is going through a lot of turmoil in his life for a lot of various reasons, and all he needed was sort of like that hand extended to him. And it can be quite simple. It really can be, but it takes a sort of willingness to sort of integrate that philosophy into how you do things. And when you do that, what happens is that you end up sort of leveling out those three security sort of things, right? You bring the onus on protection and response down just a little bit, and you elevate the prevention measures, and you make people a lot more happy. You make people a lot more connected. You are able to find things earlier that can be solved instead of waiting for them to sort of, rise and explode into a certain thing. And that sort of general satisfaction and feeling of safety and that sort of connectedness, going back to sort of the ROI, like how much ROI is that worth? How much value is that worth in your town or your school or your workplace? And, I will say this, this may seem sort of pie in the sky, sort of theoretical philosophy kind of thing. I have imparted a lot of these care teams and this philosophy into a lot of different partners in a lot of different sectors and things like that. Nobody has ever come back to me and said, yeah, we tried this. It's really not our thing. We don't like it. We're going back.
I really didn't want to cut you off there, because I think that's really important context of what you're sharing, right? We are kind of going to a degree to a full circle in terms of, is it a human element monitoring, assessing the situation, or is it an algorithm? Whatever, right? Doing that. We want the same end result. The question is, which one is the most practical and going to get there in a more human, better way, right? And I would very much so agree that humans as well. But I could tell you, you mentioned a little bit ago kind of the COVID situation. Like, there is for better or worse, very rising mentality right now of mind your business.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know another way to say that.
Yeah.
And, I don't want overlooking my shoulder, the bus driver, right? I don't need, or I don't want. Now, need and want are very different things, but I think most of it is want. I don't want, right? I want my privacy. I don't need people, seeing that like everything you described of the three examples. I think it was quitting the hockey team, breaking up with your boyfriend, and then there was one more I can't remember off the top of my head. But all three of those, generally speaking, are very normal things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the vast majority of people are like, just this is part of life. Let me live my life, right? And I do think there's a growing. So like, what's the balance between we don't want to monitor and bother everybody, right? We definitely don't want the AI algorithm, but
Right.
we want to watch out for what's going on and be vigilant, I guess is
Yeah.
a word to use here, right? Like, what is that balance? Because I think to go back to what I was saying about going into Japan, around, it's only been 6 years, but that time we were certainly in an authoritarian situation. We were being told by government officials for the first time, like, you can't leave your home.
Yep.
That, like, you don't get more authoritarian than that,
Yeah.
right? Like, you can't, for whatever reason, you can't go to work, right? Bills be damned, right?
Right.
Right? Like,
Right.
life be damned. So, like, really don't want to dance around. I really want to find out, like, what's the balance, because I think there's a lot of need for what you're doing,
Yeah. So
right?
so when I logged on, right, one of the first things that you asked me was, "Hey, how you doing?" Right? How's things going? Right? I didn't say mind your business, right? Um, I think
Right.
there's a way in which customer service kind of permeates into the security field, and I think it's something that often gets overlooked a lot. Um, I follow this guy Rory Sutherland. Is a guy out of England, marketing sort of guru, and he has this thing about the doorman fallacy. And I take that idea and move it into security. The idea being that the doorman, from like a consultant standpoint, look at that as a job of just opening the door and closing the door.
You're the first face. You're the greeting,
Right.
right?
It's
Yeah.
so much more. It's so much more. Whether it's the doorman or the valet or something like that, putting those things out into in front of a space, it translates something. It creates a narrative, right? Whether it's, oh my gosh, this they have a doorman, this must be a real classy place, and then you sort of, you know, tighten up your behavior or everything else. Same thing with the valet. Like if you go to a restaurant and they have valet, there's sort of like this aristocracy feeling that sort of envelops over you as you hand over your keys and things like that. Those types of things are not looked at. Those things are looked at more as a customer service sort of thing rather than a security thing. And I would say that it's actually both, right? You can actually tell a lot about an individual basically going to those sensory things that we've talked about from a security standpoint. That doorman knows a lot more about what's going on that street or around that corner or with the restaurant down the road and stuff like that, than you may give credit for. They know the names of the returning customers. They remember different things that they spoke about, whether it
Well,
was
this is the classic the Breakfast Club, right? You kids, you think I'm just a janitor.
yes,
I see things. I read what's in your lockers. I hear your conversations. And he kind of
right,
gets into their head, right? That classic
right,
part. Very,
yeah,
very much so. But that's kind of what I mean by when people have this natural distrust of, I don't want the garbage man, whether he has a choice or not, because he's naturally going to be absorbing his life information, right? But I don't want the garbage man watching my trash.
Well,
That's
maybe
like,
it's not watching the trash. Maybe you think that it's sort of like, again, it's that everybody is watching out for the reasons of getting you in trouble or bringing information to sort of disrupt your life.
well,
When it
again,
actually,
right? Everything that's to a hammer, everything is a
right,
nail. So,
right, right. And I'm not saying that it can't be bastardized into that way,
sure.
but what I see often on is the stoic cop in front of sort of a barbed wire reinforced metal fence with bulletproof glass and everything else has a narrative, and the doorman has a narrative and can be equally as efficient in determining where threats are going to be coming from
So
or what
so
is
take so
abnormal.
take the doorman, the context of luxury,
Mm-hmm.
right? Give them a few resources to throw in protection as well without removing the context of luxury, right? Am I hearing that?
Yeah,
What you
so
mean?
one of the things that we did, so I took that doorman fallacy thing, and I asked a school that I was working with, and I said, okay, like, what do you do in the morning when the buses sort of come in? And they were like, nothing. We wait inside, and they go through the metal detectors, and then they just go to class, right? And I'm like, all right, well, why don't you put like two or three teachers out there just to say hello in the morning? Right, as they get off the bus. And yeah, you're creating an atmosphere. Hello, we're happy you're here. How are you? How's going things? Everything else. But you're also scanning for those sort of abnormal behaviors, right? If there's one kid who's kind of hunched over, or if there seems to be like a fight happened on the bus, you can also talk to the bus drivers to see what they noticed. Maybe they didn't notice anything on the bus, but they noticed something on the way to school that might have triggered something that might require some sort of follow up or something like that, right? That's just general conversation. Well, I'm not that's not looking at sort of like a survey, using it in a sort of surveillance state type thing of you know that person has a problem, let's go scan his eyeballs sort of thing. That's just a general culture, atmosphere, environment that feels inviting, that everyone is kind of running on the same page of wanting to be safe, wanting to make sure that everybody's doing okay. And, those little minor things before you get into an environment that might make it difficult for you to sort of have those discussions in a more casual sense to figure out what might be going on. And I think there's sort of this tragic complex that we kind of keep escalating our own biases towards, right? That every single conversation is trying to find out something or get, as you mentioned, like get into your business. When in actuality, we're just trying to make sure that you're doing all right, or if you need
It's
anything, or that
it.
you have somebody that you trust that you can come to if you eventually do, right? Like saying hello, he is always nice to me, or she's always nice to me. She always gives me a high five in the morning when I get off the bus, and I know that if I have a problem, that they're going to be responsive to that problem in a way that is probably going to be much more measured than somebody who's more official looking from a security standpoint, right?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, so it's what it sounds like you're describing here is just bringing the community back into the community, right? The way it used to be is someone would notice naturally something's going on while you're at church and whatever a youth pastor pulls you aside, or I mean, this is the literally the origin story. Tony Robbins, he's acting up in class, teacher pulls him onto the side and he goes, hey man, like I know you're acting like a class clown right now, but what I see is true ability of communication. Am I right or wrong? Make a
No, you're
decision
absolutely
now, right?
you're
Les Brown's Mr. Washington. Hey, never call yourself mentally disabled again. Come here. I want to meet with you, right? It's basically those teachers in their lives doing what you're describing, but within a human way. And who knows where the progression of Les Brown or of Tony Robbins' life could have been if somebody didn't naturally step in to say, I see more in you.
absolutely. And given your experience in Japan, I have a great sort of analogous story to share. So back in the late '70s, early '80s, the two most reliable cars on the market was a Mercedes SL something or other and a Toyota Corolla, right? And people who focused in on the car industry and reported about the car industry could not figure out how this was happening. And The reason why was because Mercedes had set sort of the gold standard of manufacturing, where there was a long apprenticeship and everybody was sort of a master of one thing. And then before the car went out onto the lot, there was like a 3,000 point inspection. And so they would make sure that everything was okay for that car before it went out. And Toyota was doing none of that, right? They were giving their factory workers in the manufacturing line like 30 to 45-minute sort of videos of what they were expected to do. There was no 1,000-point inspection at the end, and they could not figure out what the hell was going on at Toyota and for quality control. And the reason why Toyota didn't have to do any of that stuff for quality control was because they were able to integrate the quality control into the manufacturing process, where they gave every single person on that manufacturing line the ability to raise their hand and stop everything when they saw something or felt that something was wrong. And the culture that they put out within that manufacturing line was, okay, you may find something. This is not to punish whoever did something wrong, because the idea being that what you find today, you may find something that I did 3 weeks from now that was wrong, and that stopped the production line. And so what it did was it gave basically ownership to everybody to have sort of the power to feel more connected as a group on this thing that they were trying to do. And what I'm trying to do is try to impart that sort of Toyota manufacturing process. Now, to Mercedes' credit, like, listen, they were able to make through their process, make one of the most reliable cars on the market. And if you want to translate this to sort of the security thing, like, yeah, you might have the best response and best protective measures, and you may be a safe place to be, right? But it only takes one car to kind of miss, one thing that you're putting a lot of pressure on solving things towards the end. And you're putting a lot of pressure on these very highly specialized people along the line to find things that are wrong. And things just get missed every once in a while. And so by sort of spreading out the responsibility and giving people not that huge knowledge base of what to do, but just to give them the empowerment of like, yeah, nobody's going to get in trouble. Just if something feels strange, like, speak up, right? Because it might be nothing or it might be something, right? But we have to be comfortable enough in sort of the environment that we're trying to create, that's able to take hold. And by integrating that into just the way Toyota did business, it didn't matter if one of those line workers left or if a manager left, right? It was just the way in which they did business. So there was plug and play the entire time, and the thing still ran perfectly because that was just the culture that was created along there. And so that's really sort of, when you sort of ask, like, okay, what does that look like? I usually use that story of Mercedes and Toyota, of like, this is what it looks like, is that, teachers or superintendents or bosses or staff will come and go as they please. But this sort of mentality is locked in where everybody can just sort of get in, because you're not asking people to do anything that they're not already hardwired and doing already, right? You are just providing them with the green light that if they do see something or feel something, that you are willing to listen to them out and that you will address it right then and there, instead of letting it sort of fester and say, well, we have SROs or we have a behavioral threat assessment team. It's their responsibility. And if it gets too big, they'll be able to respond on time. Because I've been going to tell you, I have another example. In Dayton, Ohio, there was a guy, Connor Betts, who at sort of like 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, after sort of the bars were being flushed out on this one strip in Dayton, ended up shooting a bunch of people. In fact, 9 people were killed, 27 people were injured. That incident took all of 32 seconds. All right. He traveled all of 100 feet. And from the first shot to the point where law enforcement knocked him down was 32 seconds. And the reason they were able to be so quick is because there were already 6 to 8 cops already on that street for crowd control, because it was sort of the time when all the bars were coming out. And so I challenge any sort of law enforcement entity in this country to do better than 32 seconds in their response time, right? You're going to have a tough time threading that needle. And what came out after this random act of violence was that Connor had behavioral issues from the time he was about 8 years old, that he had been in and out of expelling from school, all kinds of different school problems, that he had touch points with mental health, that he had touch points with law enforcement and everything else. And there was this long, very, typical sort of escalatory character arc that had happened. The more you focus on the protection and the response, you are putting a lot of pressure on those people to catch everything that they see. All right, or everything that they are told. And as I mentioned, sort of, you are trying to get to see where those little ripples are. And if you are so focused on dealing with the big stuff, you are not going to be focused on those little things. And so by spreading that knowledge base out, providing people with the acceptable sort of, that you are willing to hear sort of all these things, that you don't have to go necessarily to the SRO. You don't have to go to the behavioral threat assessment team or the care team. You can go to basically anybody, and anybody is free and empowered to sort of at least see, if they are willing, if, like you just said, like, hey, how you doing today? Mind your business. All right. Maybe there's something there, right? Like if I said that to you, that would be your sort of your first thought. Like, oh, okay, there's something going on. Maybe I need to talk to somebody else that might be able to connect with that individual, that person is kind of having a tough time, right? They may not like me. They may not want to talk to me. They may not want to talk to, the SRO, but they may talk to, somebody at the House of Worship, or they may talk to somebody that they like at the Department of Recreation, or they may talk to that woman downtown who runs the pottery shop, right? And so by spreading out that relationship, you sort of are allowing yourself to have more upside optionality in the whole thing. And I think that's sort of the key of bringing this whole prevention methodology and philosophy to the sort of the forefront.
I want to dive in here a little bit to culture,
Sure.
in general, because it wasn't. I mean, look, there's always been problems. Obviously, social media has amplified things that were always there. There's definitely an element of that, but I just don't feel like there was such a. I'm using those words, right? It didn't feel like there was this buzzing, this underlying anxiety, this underlying angst. Everyone's on guard, right? How do we bring, like, we're talking about upriver, downriver, right? Politics is downriver of culture, is that old expression, right? Violence to a certain degree, similarly, right? There's a chain of events that have happened to get us to a inevitable end conclusion. Or is it not inevitable? So how can we start to address this within culture, not just within a stress, like a trained team per se, but like, what are you seeing as some of the solutions that we can really, turn this sense of angst around in culture?
I mean, the what is it, the $1 trillion question, right?
Come on, Robert, solve the problem. No, just kidding.
Yeah, part of it, a lot of what we've been talking about, and a lot of what I do talk about every day when I go, and present to different people of a lot of different sectors and different backgrounds and things like that, is context, and understanding sort of how the brain and emotions sort of move to different things. And I think there are a lot of things right now that are always competing for our attention. And we have never been more connected, I think, than ever, and yet we have never been more sort of alone. It was just sort of like this weird sort of paradox that we have, and there's been a bunch of different articles and studies that have shown that over the last 25 years or so, like that, we have the rates of people who feel lonely have gone skyrocketed, and things like that. From a biological sense, I've worked with a couple of interesting endeavors and things like that from a biological standpoint, that we're looking at sort of the online content and sort of what it does from a biological standpoint. And mainly these programs were focused on trying to teach kids 18 and under sort of what the social media landscape was like. Yeah, you are way more savvy in how to work these programs, but you're not very savvy in what they are actually doing to your brain. And the dopamine.
Do you think that's because they don't know? They're not educated on what
No,
it's doing to them?
I think this is something that like you see throughout. Like I'll fully admit it. Like I'm just as addicted to this thing as anybody else. I think it is the tool in which the new generation communicates, is simply what it is. And we are just not evolutionarily wise there yet. Like our brains cannot sort of filter what is real and what is not real on this thing in the same way. And so one of the studies that was done was basically, you and I are having this conversation, and both of us are getting dopamine hits into our brain because we're having this connection and everything else. And that once we finish this conversation, that dopamine, because we've had a human to human, even though it's through digital, will fade at a certain level, right? And if we were in the same room together, it would fade at a much slower pace. And so your brain sort of like gets used to not, it sort of weans its way off of the dopamine slowly. What they have found with social media and with the phone is that you get that rise of a dopamine hit in the same way that you and I would have a conversation, but as soon as it turns off, it just shuts right down, right? It just drops through the floor. And so your brain goes into this like shock where it's like, whoa, what the heck? What just happened? Right? Like we were feeling really, really good here. What the hell just happened? Get whatever that thing that was giving me that dopamine, get that thing back on. Right? Because it was just you just cut it cold turkey. And so I think that physically, that almost addiction sort of translates into us having to sort of be more and more and more connected. By being more and more connected, we feel sort of that things that are not directly associated with our everyday life are associated with our everyday life, right? That they're, because it's coming through our feed, it's coming through our algorithm, and therefore there's this sort of intrinsic feeling of call to action on every single thing that we see, even though it's either happening halfway around the world or it's something that really doesn't have anything to do with our day-to-day life, or something that we could really impact in any sort of meaningful way within our life. And I think that sense of being bombarded with all of that stuff, and that knowledge of almost helplessness, that you are sort of not able to have an impact on all of these things that are happening, creates sort of like an identity crisis in us. And as I mentioned earlier, like we're always in search of identity, purpose, and community. And so if we have this sort of identity crisis, or if we have a purpose crisis where we're not able to impact the world in a certain way, or we feel disconnected to a certain community, that that rocks the boat a little bit. And I think through then we just get more online, and we get more on, right, and we've kind of created this, unfortunately, politics aside, the way in which we've sort of structured our politics of sort of, two-party system, and knowing how radicalization works, of you got to be something, right? There is nothing for the middle, right? And so you have to trend in one way or the other. And as those communities begin to sort of splinter off more and more and more, um, you see these sort of like purity tests that sort of like kind of creep up, right? And so you begin to get pulled in a lot of different directions, that you have to be associated with something, and it becomes more and more difficult to sort of figure out what your identity is, what your purpose is, and where you sit in a community. And so I think that it has contributed all to sort of, the multi factor approach of all these things are kind of hitting us all at once. And just from a biological level, we are not necessarily designed to take it. And then from a societal level, we are struggling to catch up to the speed of which things are happening.
So keeping more community, real life experiences in the real world, things along those lines.
Well, I think you have to have certain touch points to reality. I think, right? I don't think it's necessarily like, bring the kumbaya community back, but it's, you have to have something of a touch point of reality, of working through sort of issues or problems, or knowing that certain people are there that can help, and that have different experiences, and can guide you through certain things. I think there is especially with, there's I heard this great story of the ELIZA program. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I have not.
So the ELIZA program is basically a precursor to AI. So it was this MIT professor who created this computer program, and it mirrors the philosophy is slipping my mind, but basically what it does, the psychological theory behind it was that you did mirroring. So I say, how are you today? Well, I'm not doing so well. What about today is making you not do so well, or something like that, right? Like you take a portion of what is said by basically the patient, and you just repeat their words back to them. And so he created this program called ELIZA that basically just did that. I forget what the name of the philosophy was. And he had his secretary do it, and it was supposed to be like a 5-minute sort of testing run. And he came back in, and she said, "Hey, can you just give me some more time?" And he was like, "Yeah, have as much time as you want." And after about 3 hours, he had to go in and say, like, "Okay, we got to cut this off," right? And there was something about hearing your own thoughts repeated back to you that was so comforting, that you intrinsically divulged more information out.
So the idea of being truly understood was
Truly
so
understood.
rare that it was like, I want to keep going with this.
Truly understood, or being presented with something with no bias, right? And I think modern sort of, social media programs, and certainly AI. I mean, there's that great meme that's going around of like the dumbest person that is being told by AI that they have a great idea. It's like, I think modern AI has that sort of ELIZA thing to it, where in order for the AI to learn, it needs you to stay on it. And so by repeating a lot of what you say, and providing you with sort of that comfort that, yeah, no, I totally see where you're going with, I agree with it and stuff like that. Sort of like Eliza, you end up getting sort of sucked into this thing. Um, and the more things become harder and harder to decipher what is real, what is fake, um, you begin to sort of see how, that we talked about, sort of that almost that intervention, right? Like, no, you're wrong. That's a fake thing. No, that can't be a wrong and fake thing, because that provided me with, that reinforced my identity, that reinforced my purpose, and that reinforced something that the community was already saying, right? And so, no, I'm not going to believe what you said, because you're coming from a different way. It becomes an us versus them. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that there's really a great antidote, or just this sort of magical awakening that we're all going to sort of have. It's going to be something where, if you looked at, so like in the late 90s, my dad, was kind of at a certain point in his career where, and then they were trying to institute email, right? And he would get an email, and then he would just email back, call me, right? Because it was just such a weird technology thing that,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
he couldn't see the point of, like, why would I,
We're coming full circle to that, by the way. Just like
right, like,
text
why
it
would
back and
I
call me.
sit
Yeah.
why would I sit here and type something out when you can just call me and I can tell you? um and I think sometimes with this AI stuff, I sort of think that that's going to be kind of what it's just going to be an evolution, right? Like, nobody could see MySpace when it came out turning into Instagram and Snapchat. Like, that had to just be sort of something that sort of just matured into that was just sort of discovered. And I sort of think we're kind of at that stage now, where, like, certain people are at a certain point in their career or life where, like, AI is cool, but it's not really moving the needle in terms of, like, getting them a different sort of experience, or elevating the experience anymore. But there are kids now who will sort of, taking that line from Bane in Batman, like, you were merely adopted the darkness, I was born into it. Sort of, they are going to find new uses for this technology and communicate, and use it, to create different connections and create different communities in a way that we can't even imagine right now. But that's not something that that's something that we're just going to kind of have to wait and see. Um, but yeah, it's, I this is sort of less sort of targeted violence stuff, but more, as you sort of mentioned, sort of culture and community. Um, One of the things that I've been really, really fascinated with has been, architectural, like behavioral architecture, or choice architecture, and how it's implemented into, society. And one of the sectors that I've loved hearing about how they've done this is really the transportation sector. So the transportation sector is always looking at new, different ways of making roads safer, or communities, safer, and doing things, finding studies of, like, instead of using a speed camera or flashing speed on a road to try and get people to slow down, and things like that, they found that if they just flashed a smiley face or a frowny face, that it actually had more of an emotional impact on us, and we would slow down naturally. They've instituted these things called pedestrian refuges, which are like these little concrete islands that they put in between, two-lane roads, and it usually has like a pedestrian crossing that cuts through the island. And these things stick out maybe like 6 or 8 inches on either side of the lane, but that 6 or 8 inches goes just enough to narrow our focus when we're driving, that we naturally release off the pedal and we'll slow down. They've done things called, I think it's called necking, I hear it up here in the Northeast after a snowstorm. They call it like snecking or something like that, where they'll take aerial photos of traffic patterns after a snowstorm. So once you don't have the same visual cues of, how you're going to turn onto a different street or something like that, before all the shoveling happens, what they'll see is that we actually take wider and longer turns and slower turns around different things. And what that does is that allows city planners to sort of bump out the sidewalks, or make them a little bit bigger, the intersections a little bit smaller. And what by doing so, we create sort of a safer intersection, with better lines of sight and everything else. These are all kind of like crazy things. And those things get translated into other things. There have been schools that have implemented sort of like healthier lunch programs and things like that. But all they ended up having to do was create sort of this stacked sort of display case, and they put the healthier options on top, and then they put the sort of the pizzas and the French fries on the bottom. And so instead of having just a single line of sight where you're like, oh, I like the pizza, I like the French fries, I'm not going to take the salad. If the salad is sort of up above the pizza, we are more inclined to take what's right in front of our up on top instead of what's on the bottom. And so more kids were eating more of the healthier snacks than going for the pizza. One company that's done a lot of research on this, and I do speak about this sometimes in my presentations, is Starbucks. And regardless of what you think about Starbucks, at their peak, they were opening up a brick and mortar store every 6 hours, right? And you don't get that type of saturation into the market by, just the taste of your overbrewed coffee, right? Like, there's a lot of other emotional things that have to get imparted onto customers to do that. And one of the main things that they were trying to do with Starbucks was create a similarity between European cafe culture, where they wanted people to sort of stay and have conversations and do that sort of community stuff.
Become the third place.
Right.
Work, home, the cafe.
Right. And the problem was that when they looked at the coffee makers that they were going to import from Europe, they were too slow. And they were quiet because so people could talk, but they were way too slow for an American audience. And then the ones that were fast were too loud and people couldn't hear anything. So they ended up having to commission a new coffee maker that was loud enough that you knew your coffee was being made, but quiet enough that you could actually have a conversation. And I say that in sort of like, well, wow, that's kind of cool, dinner party talk, but like, what does that have to do with security? Well, it has a lot to do with security, because the behaviors that were getting people to buy that coffee, they were looking at the very granular things like noise, things like moving the HVAC system to over the tables so that you smelt sort of the warm croissants and things like that. Things like lumens of what type of temperature lighting needed to be in that vicinity. Things like wood tones, things like color scheme, things like the texture on the walls, things like the soundtrack that was being played on the loudspeakers, the way in which the baristas asked you what your name was, and the way in which you had a totally different language, like venti and tall meant something different than just regular, medium, and small, right? And so what it does is it just creates different behaviors in that. And one of the things that they did was they put sort of, as you were entering into the store, you saw a sign that said like Starbucks is the #1 purchaser of fair trade coffee in the world, which was true. But it counted for less than 1% of their total buy. But every marketing person will tell you, like, as you walk into the store, that's not a marketing place. That's not a selling area, that's a message area. And so if you want people to pay 4 times as much as coffee, you need to make them feel as though they are doing something sort of altruistic in that purchase. And so these are all sort of like these little mental hacks that we have at our disposal in a lot of different areas, whether it's the commercial sector or it's the food sector or it's the transportation sector, to get people to feel something that then moves them into a behavior. And we don't necessarily do that. And that kind of goes back to sort of my customer service kind of stuff conversation that we were sort of having, right? Like if people feel something or believe that something is within an environment, they naturally tend to do behaviors that you want to have, right? People are generally more nicer in places that have a valet and a doorman. People are more likely to feel comfortable in a place that has different type of lighting and a different color scheme and things like that. And when you go to a school and you sort of go into a cafeteria and the noise is reverberating over everything and there's fluorescent lights everywhere and you can sort of see these white cinder blocks that are the walls and things like that, it creates a different type of environment, and the behaviors might be sort of ricocheting, or the vibrations, not to get too meta on this, sort of can cause things that are opposite of the behaviors that you sort of want to sort of have.
So then, like, what do you see? It's where my mind goes anyway. What do you see how do you see the impact of McDonaldization in society, right? Everything is a square box. Everything is as efficient as possible, as systematized as possible. There's SOPs for all of it. It has to be the most efficient at all times, rather than you see, I mean, I think now more than ever, people are talking about like how architecture used to be, right? Cathedrals used to be. Then you look at modern day churches, you even mosques in a lot of ways are shaping differently and are being right. And how that actually impacts, right? Because like if you go to a really nice private school, there's a lot of mahogany, a lot of wood handles, railings, carpet to a degree. There's portraits and paintings and artwork on the walls. They usually have wallpaper, right? You go to a modern day public school, it's that stereotypical, right? You know what? Actually, here's a better way to say this. Same building, different experience. You ever been to a hotel?
Yeah.
Has a theme, has a design. You go into the back room of the same hotel, regardless of whether it's a 5-star like a Four Seasons or the hotel down the road, and then it's the same taupe color. It's the same, it's just bland. So, like, do you see that as having a direct impact on the way kids are learning? And do you feel we should be going back to more of the traditional, or
I think we've sort of optimized for efficiency, right? So we've created metrics based upon sort of either, optimization of output or financial optimization, right? And so it is easier to optimize.
So this is where I get confused. I don't mean to cut you off, but like the data is so clear that being surrounded by colors increases cognitive performance. Why did we remove cognitive? Like if the data is for output, right? If we've optimized for output, we're not optimizing for output, right? Being surrounded. I remember growing up, for example, I don't even remember what they called it, but we had like, this is like really early 2000s, 90s. But we had like classes or standardized test week or whatever, right? Right after No Kid Left Behind, Child Left Behind was passed. And I remember them putting like, colorful paper all over the tables and putting posters of colors up. And I remember asking my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Floyd, shout out, like, hey, what's going on? And she shared like, well, they've proven that this creates better cognitive performance. I was like, great. Why are we doing this when you are being evaluated for this week? Why not at all times, right? Or why are we allowed gum this week? Like they allowed us to have chewing gum. Well, we've proven that people perform better when they have something to, move on or think on,
Mm-hmm.
or they're chewing on and they have stimulus. And it's like, okay, great. Why is this the only 5 days of the week that we're allowing this? And then next Monday you're going to get mad at me for having gum again. What are we doing here? Right? So when you say we're optimizing for output, are we?
We're optimizing for a certain output, and it depends on sort of what the metric of that output is, and what kind of data set that you are looking to have, right? So if they are interested in getting sort of a momentary sort of bump up, that sort of makes sense, right? If their metric is to get the highest test scores that they can on this particular test, they pull out all the stops to get that sort of spike. And then once they get it, they don't see the efficiency or the optimization of needing it more. And so they probably drop it, right? And so this kind of goes to the same sort of analogy of the sort of the doorman fallacy, right? Like we can't put a doorman on every place. So we'll reduce the individual's role to just opening and closing the door, and then you can accomplish this by having an automatic door and maybe a security camera or something like that. It's a good question. I don't know where exactly it went sort of awry. There may be a lot of logical explanations for it. But I do think that sort of you mentioned sort of like the McDonald'sification of everything, where where I'm at in Rhode Island probably looks, I could go to someplace in Nashville and not know that I was even in a different state, right? That all of the stores are the same, all of the restaurants are relatively the same, or they all taste the same, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that kind of contributes to this general malaise of having this sort of identity and community sort of drop, right? Where there isn't sort of this core thing within us of pride where we're at, or uniqueness, probably more than anything else, of like, yeah, this is something that we do slightly different. I don't have a great answer for it, but I definitely feel it as well. I don't think that we are going to be able to redesign all of the schools and buildings and everything else. But what I would like is to sort of have a more conscious approach towards sort of avant-garde methods to try and get to solve similar problems, right? Like it doesn't cost a whole lot to re-examine the lighting in a school, or it doesn't cost a whole lot to think about soundproofing certain things, or different different colors on the walls and things like that. So there may be certain legal things in certain states off of certain different paints are flame retardant. I don't know. I would think by this point we would have had something that could sort of bridge those types of things. But yeah, I do sort of feel this sort of general malaise that I think you feel as well.
Well, and it's not it's not just school, right? Obviously,
Right.
that's just one example where, like, I'm in the Nashville area, grew up here, true local, didn't just move here. It wasn't the cool place when I grew up. Let's put it that way, right? There wasn't Starbucks headquarters wasn't moving here, okay,
Right.
the way it is now. Just like kind of go back to what you were saying there, but like there's a reason why that bookshelf behind me is wooden. My desk, it's wooden. There's a permanence to it, and I started seeing this, like 15, 20 years ago, where I would see new homes being built. Whereas like the homes that are that maybe 30, 35 years old, maybe a little bit older, would all be made out of brick and stone. And there's an element of permanence to that. And I do a lot of real estate throughout the Southeast. So, right, like I just remember seeing this, and then I remember seeing the transition to where they're doing more laminate, and they're
Mhm.
doing different textures. And I just remember just going, it just doesn't have that same like great
Mhm.
GDPism winning, right? Bring your capital, bring your jobs, great. But I just remember this shift taking place, and now every new build, every new build that I see, it's very easy to like drive by down the road and go, that's a flip. That's a flip.
Mhm.
That's a new build. And it's just, there's a lack of permanence there. There's a lack of character there. And it's like over optimization. But again, are you actually over optimizing if I have the data to prove that the output is actually better with colors and wood? Right?
Depends on what you're measuring,
True.
right? Depends on
True.
what you're measuring. And so I think that's sort of the crux of it, of, you know, in the same way that, we are assigning a certain metric of value to the protection and the response measures and everything else, which is, what metric are we using for that, to create that value? And I think it has sort of gone haywire to basically everything in our society, right?
And
Where
this is
everything,
exactly what I wanted to ask you, by the way.
yeah,
Not to cut you off there. But rather than what metric are you judging, your results? I don't mean to use the word results, but progress, right? What measure are you? Because what we don't want to do, I think we talked about that in the very, very beginning, so I'll come in full circle, rather than, how long has it been since an incident, which is kind of
right.
like that stereotypical 58 days since we had an accident, right? Type thing. Let's get a pizza party. What do you see as the most valuable metrics in that way, and what you want to measure the
The valuable
success?
so there's a lot of different metrics that they can do. They can do things like, staff retention, like how satisfied are people going into work, and staff turnover and things like that. Um, if it's schools, you can sort of begin to sort of see, queries of just the feeling of people wanting to come to school. So usually when we institute these things, tardiness and absenteeism kind of goes down because people are excited to kind of come back to school.
That
Um,
feels like a really big one to me. If you can demonstrate tardiness going down, satisfaction in school in general, that's a big win.
yeah.
That's a big
Um,
win.
general general downfall in different behavioral problems or outbursts and things like that. Um, just a general sense of happiness and togetherness and things like that. Some that which really doesn't have much of a metric, but you can definitely see things that are outside of, like I said, just because something didn't happen or a shooting didn't happen doesn't mean that things are necessarily working. But you look at sort of those other more subjective things, those feelings, right? Like, are they feeling better, which is creating a better behavioral environment, and then their thoughts and opinions about that place have completely changed in sort of the same way that the first time car buyers thought, oh, it's cool tech and it goes vroom vroom real fast. I love that. And then all of a sudden, no, the reason why I bought this car was for environmental impact, right? Like, so you begin to sort of test those sort of things rather than sort of a numerical metric. You begin sort of doing this sort of ranking sort of system of sort of what do you like, and you begin to sort of see the changes in their thoughts and opinions about where they are working, or where they are, what they are doing, or why they keep coming back. And you can sort of see how that order sort of changes. And those are kind of the metrics of success that I sort of look at. And also, as I was sort of saying, like, I haven't dealt with a client where we've instituted this type of philosophy into their environment and they've come back. I've done sort of like a follow up with them, and they've told me, yeah, like, it just wasn't working, or we just couldn't make it work. Most of the time it's one of these things like we love it. It's completely changed the culture of the place. And there's no way that we're going to go back to doing what we were doing. And in fact, as new issues sort of arise, or as new students, or new different things kind of come at us from a problems perspective, we take a different angle on how we're going to address it, because you have sort of opened our minds to the idea of the feeling to the behavior, identity, purpose, community, those kind of drivers of different things. So we look at whether it's e-cigarettes in schools, or if it's something else, phone addiction or things like that. We look at the more humanistic, like what can we do to make people feel, or what can we put in place where they'll actually do the behavior we want without being sort of a no, 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 no kind of thing. And that to me goes a super long way, and allows for a lot more inventive ideas to sort of spring up, rather than sort of, as you sort of mentioned, sort of this more authoritarian of like, you shall not do this, you shall not do that, and making people sort of feel like they may not fit in a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. That fine line. Only, and I say that as someone who has seen the upstream in Japan, as I mentioned earlier, where I look and I just remember and I just go, wow, right? I mean, my family's there now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like by the way, my wife is Japanese, as in like from Japan. She's a citizen, so that's kind of how. I didn't anticipate this. It wasn't like a plan. I didn't love Japan and anime, and I wanted to move out there. It was kind of like life happens. Here we
Mm-hmm.
are, kids later, and all that jazz. But at the same time, so being able to see that, I just like there's something upstream there, right? But today more than ever, especially over the last 6 years, 10 years, people are just so on edge and
Yeah.
so reluctant to and hey, why are you looking over my shoulder? Don't take my rights. Hey, don't bother me. Let me live my life. Don't report me because
Right.
I'm going through very ordinary things in life, like I'm a mile away from my home. It's because I'm going to my friend's house, not because you know what I mean. I'm lost and you don't need child protective services to come to
Right.
my house and talk to my parents. You have like this fine line, this
Yeah.
balance,
Yeah,
right?
we've kind of gotten locked into sort of this fight or flight mode, and it's going to be sort of difficult to kind of figure out exactly what triggered it and what made it get kind of stuck in that
Well,
way.
to your point, to be clear here, the answer, okay, we could end, again, going back because it's a simple, like, example to school violence, like we could basically end school violence by putting a metal detector at every single door and men with machine guns outside. You probably wouldn't have a security risk at that point, right? Possibly, probably going to go down quite a lot. Is that really the answer we want?
Right. Is that
To
the
your
is that
point,
the is that the environment that we want to live in? Right. And is that going to make us feel safer? Going back to my story about the liquor store, right? Like, I was in the safest place I've ever been in my life. Like, I've been in government buildings that had less security, and so,
very
you know,
timely example.
yeah, yeah. Um, but I didn't want to be in that store. I couldn't wait to get out of that store. And if you wanted me to do long division, or if you were asking me to sit there and, write a story or a paper or do other types of math or something like that, like, I don't know if I would be able to have the concentration to do it. And, you know, we have to understand that we mold our behaviors within the context of how the environment makes us feel. And it's one of the major pitfalls that I see within the security field, is that kind of stuff is taken as sort of pie in the sky, that it's not measurable. There's no metrics that can be deduced from it. And it's much easier and logical, as you said, to put more guards, and more guns and more lights and more cameras and everything else into a space and say, look, we gave it our best effort, and we spent a whole lot of money, and who's going to push back on us that it wasn't worth it, right? Because we don't have a metric that can tell you that it wasn't worth it. So what are you going to tell me just about your feelings? So I think it's something where we have to sort of broaden our scope of looking a little bit more into the nuances of how we interact with different environments and what that narrative creates. And because safety is such a subjective thing within itself, that it often can go from person to person. And so trying to look at those more aesthetic things, whether it is, a different color, or it's putting a doorman out, or having sort of that Toyota model of sort of allowing everybody to kind of have a say if they feel that something is awry, and not have sort of like a consequence based sort of threat looming over you at all times if you do say something and it's wrong, that we were doing it out of, it's understood that it was done out of an altruistic reason rather than trying to get you in trouble, and a good Samaritan kind of thing. And so, hopefully going forward, we'll be able to have enough people that kind of listen to this program, or kind of come around to this idea that like there needs to be a new approach, right? We've been hardening these sites for a long time now, and it doesn't really seem like it's helping at all. And in fact, it really seems to be creating more of that fight or flight anxiety within everybody, that at any time there's going to be something that's going to pop off and kill us. And so we need to find a new approach, and we need to take a different approach.
I could not agree more. And I think one of the biggest reasons why I was like, I gotta connect with you. I gotta see what you're doing and learn a little bit more about this perspective, is because I think it bleeds over in a significantly bigger way than just risk management. Like, I think the same conversation right now is happening about the economy. Is we've had these metrics of GDP, right? We've had these tried and true flagship methods, but it's like, if GDP reaches the highest levels ever, but quality of life is significantly lower, unhappiness is significantly lower, self-harm has never been higher, depression has never been higher, you're like, is the economy really doing that good? And if it is, hypothetically, at what cost?
And does that matter?
And I
Right?
think this is a bigger, exactly. What does it matter? I think this is a bigger conversation than simply just risk management or safety per se, but it's really taking shape right now because we are in a position, we're at a fork in the road. And I think at a minimum, regardless of where people are at, like, everybody can kind of sense that there needs to be a reshaping of how we're looking at what the economy means with the rise of nanotechnology and AI coming. What does safety actually even mean? And great, you haven't had a school shooting in your state forever, but at what cost to get there, right? Is it the men outside with total lockdown at all times? Like, I think this conversation is happening very much so within society at large. How are we dealing with our neighborhoods, right? Like, how are we dealing with HOA, the economy? Like, all of these conversations of kind of rethinking and reshaping. In this subject specifically for safety and prevention, when I came across your stuff, I'm like, I really want to hear his thoughts and perspectives on this, because I do think there is a fine line, and I don't think people are currently listening to the nuances. Right. Like, I do think at the beginning of this, I think a lot of people are going to be like, stay out of my business. Right. Hey, how are you doing? Stay out of my business. But there's such a nuance to what we're talking about here, where it's like, yo, okay, great. Correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but you're not saying we need a camera in every room watching you at all times, because when you threw out that folder, right, that's suspicious behavior and we need to strip your rights. I'm going to go ahead and go on a limb and say that's not what you're saying here, right?
That's not what
But
I'm saying. Yeah.
but there are people that naturally are going to tune out when you start to talk about having the bus drive. You know what I mean? Like, this is the
Hmm.
lack of nuance, but the pressure is building and we are at a fork in the road of where we can go. And I think this conversation is extremely important, and what you are doing is extremely important, because one thing about time is it's not stopping and we're going somewhere. We might as well direct it into a more cohesive, better place we want to go to anyway, right?
No, I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Well, Robert, it is amazing to connect with you, to talk here. Talk to me. TV, TP, where can people find you? What can they expect?
Yep, tvtpsolutions.com. So TVTP is an acronym that stands for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So we have a website that has a contact page on the website. So we work, as you've probably can imagine, we work with all sectors and all different fields. So don't feel that you're not within our bailiwick, and we will have a conversation with you and figure out how we get the most impactful, whether it's a training or a consultation or an evaluation or whatever it is. The one thing that we don't do is we don't take on casework. So if you have somebody that you're worried about, or you think is heading down a pathway of violence, by all means call the appropriate authorities. Tell them that you think that they may be going down a pathway of violence. That's usually a good indicator for people for those professionals to hear, to sort of pique their interest and things like that. But please don't call me. We don't have the clinical expertise to do those types of intercessions and those off-ramping sort of management and things like that. But we are able, most certainly, to try and instill this type of culture into your environment, your office, your school, your town, and we're able to speak about it and what it looks like. And so, by all means, please give us a call or an email. We're happy to call and talk to you. And Quinton, I can't thank you enough for platforming me, and I'm glad that we had this conversation, and I'm happy to come back anytime if you'll have me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Robert, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it. I love the nuance, and I think it's wildly important, as I said. So